So, why don't we hop into it? I so Norgard, you have like a thing you were saying you would wanted to go over like some material of some kind, which I'm intrigued by. So do you want to hop in with that? You want to start there, or do we want to do a little round first, or I don't know. I'm not sure what sort of material you've got prepared for us, so where it would fit best.
Yeah, well, so what was her? So I can't remember. Did she say that her preferred name was Zoe?
Oh, Christina. Yeah, right. Sorry, Christina, Zoe,
Yeah.
something. Yes.
So yeah, Christina, she said she wanted to present for that, but
Sure. Well, all right, that's good. So then
one thing I could do, I'm not sure though, if essentially like you defer something for 1 week, to make sure everybody's present, but I don't even know if she is requesting that we defer one, or if
let's start. We can start with maybe just a little round robin, and then see if she or others show up, and kind of go from there. So I guess I'll just go quick at first here. For me, this is I feel like some of this stuff is very it's very expository, sort of getting into a framework, and maybe just because I've read a number of his other works, I feel like things don't really, like the rubber doesn't really meet the road until the following chapters. So this one I felt was pretty kind of continuing on with some of the scaffolding that he's going to build on around holarchy. And I guess maybe what came out for me here was, I think it was finally in reading this book, and maybe even this chapter specifically, that I finally really got the whole idea of the quadrants and the tetra arising component, which actually, now that I say that, I don't think he actually brings up the quadrants until a little bit later. So maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but the idea that individuals and their social context are sort of interdependent or co-arising, codependent, sort of, I feel like is one of the main points that he's making here. And one of my questions, or sort of like, is this necessarily the case, is I can understand very intuitively how wanting to build a division between interior and exterior makes a lot of sense. Like, yes, my individual subjective experience is very different from objective analytical or empirical measurement, things like that. The division between individual and social is less so. And so here I feel like he gives some good reasons for appreciating that no individual can really kind of be taken apart from its context. So I don't know, that was the thing that stood out for me. But I don't know, I see, anyone want to jump in next after that?
I'd like to ask a brief question of you. Is that, sure. Does that mean you feel that the boundary between inside and outside is an illusion?
The boundary. Well, gosh, so that's a big thing. I mean, what I would say to that is, well, my point was actually that I feel that the inside-outside boundary is more intuitive than the singular plural distinction. Because in trying to sort of apply kind of an Occam's razor thing, I kind of want to be like, well, maybe he's unnecessarily adding an additional division here where there doesn't need to be. Maybe we could just be working with inside outside. But the fact that we've got inside and outside, and then he'll also do individual and social, it just seemed like, well, maybe that's an unnecessary step. And so in the deeper sense of what is intuitively seems to ring true, I think that the inside outside distinction is very immediate. Now, a question like that is also, it's sort of, like in in Tibetan Buddhist contexts and in other probably Buddhist contexts as well, they talk about relative truth and absolute truth, right? So like, you know, maybe in absolute, truth context, we're talking about there is no self, but in relative truth context, like it's meaningful to talk about selves and people and individuals and things. Similarly, I think, you know, once you get into kind of where this is going with the non-dual thing, I think that the inside and the outside might disappear, but that doesn't mean that at scale or at a different, you know, from a different angle or perspective or level, that those aren't meaningful terms. So I would say pretty much it seems like the whole way down, and this is something he'll get into, is trying to distinguish like what the non-dual ground of everything, how that relates to all this form stuff. But we, you know, that we're again kind of getting ahead there. But I guess I would say illusion in some ways, yes, but at the same time, it's like a really helpful and pretty necessary distinction that pretty much applies the whole way through until you get to any kind of non-dual state, would be, I guess, how I'd answer that. It's my impression. Anyone else? I see Cole's got his hand up.
If Sarah has a comment about what was talked about, I kind of have another question about the chapter. So go ahead, Sarah.
Thanks. Sorry, I keep forgetting that there's a hand icon. The interior, exterior thing always interests me from this, just simply from the perspective of architecture. And I have thought, I find it very interesting for me to think that there actually, there is no such thing as the exterior and that everything is an interior. And it becomes very interesting, for example, if you start to imagine a city as an interior, or a landscape, or gardens specifically, but landscapes as kinds of interiors. For me, that was very enlightening when I first came across it. But I think what's so interesting about this chapter is the I'm just going to paraphrase it, is the cosmos being in us, as opposed to being a great outerness. It's a great innerness. And for me, that was that blew my mind in this chapter. That's really what got me.
Yeah. Layman, I saw your hand go up with that. Is that if you, I know Cole had a
I would just
question.
be touching in with my general feeling of the chapter. So maybe Cole wants to go.
Okay. Yeah, Cole, go for it.
Oh, pardon me. It was mainly about the chess analogy, where I thought I was following along, and then all of a sudden I kind of was backtracking, and I was wondering if somebody could explain that analogy a little bit better. That's my question.
I could have a go at it, and anyone else can correct my go. Would be that what I interpret him as saying there is, you know, actually it's funny that four-dimensional chess was sort of a trope that kept coming up over the past couple of years, at least here in America, because of questions about our political situation. But so anyway, that term has been in the air a lot. But I think that's really what he's talking about here, is the idea of like four-dimensional chess. So, or checkers, I guess. So if you have one plane and you've got a bunch of things, you know, like checkers pieces that are sort of playing out their game at, let's say, dimension one, then they're all interacting with each other, and that's the plane that they're working at. Those are the rules of the game at that one dimension. Now, if you stack another piece on top of that first piece, you can almost imagine that you've stacked a whole other plane on top of that first plane. So now you've got two dimensions, and so now you've got pieces that are two-dimensional, and these pieces on top are going to be interacting with those pieces in that domain. But the ones that are sort of just at the first tier, they're not operating at that level. They can't even probably, quote unquote, see those second tier chess or checkers pieces, right? And then you can just kind of keep stacking so that, you know, relative to each other, if you've got four, say, stacked checkers pieces, then you can, you know, navigate a four-dimensional checkers space, and you can be playing with rules at other checkers pieces at four dimensions. But if you're working with one dimension, then that's sort of the only thing that applies there. And yet four-dimensional checkers also is reliant upon all the other first-dimensional checkers playing. It just adds additional layers so that it's sort of like a game is playing out, but the more levels that you add on top of it, they're all dependent upon the ones below it, but they also add new maybe elements to the game as you kind of stack things on top. And so that was sort of a metaphor for him talking about these different holarchies and what they're relating to. That was my take on it. I don't know if anyone else interpreted it with other elements. I don't know. Is that helpful, or is that still?
No, that was helpful. That was most of my takeaway, but it seemed like it was a very pivotal analogy to like move forward with a lot of his things. So I just wanted to make sure that I was understanding the key elements of it.
Yeah, I mean, like maybe to bring in some of the material he's talking about, where like I'm an animal and I work in the biosphere, but I also have a mind so I'm also operating in the noosphere. So those are at least two different tiers in which I'm interacting. Now, if I interact with another animal that is non-human and doesn't have a mind that's operating in the noosphere, then we can both be interacting at the biological level and kind of playing that game together, but I can't do noosphere level stuff with that animal, right? But if I talk to another human who's also doing the noosphere thing, we can play out at that level. So it's sort of the stacking of these different emergent levels of reality, and sort of, it's kind of situating what's able to happen at those different levels of existence, I guess. Again, my take. I don't know if anyone wants to fill that out more, but Layman, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I guess what I saw in this chapter is just how relentlessly he goes after the idea that bigger is better, right? He's doing it in two different ways in this chapter. One is saying that, the sheer number of entities in a zone or a category doesn't make it the more inclusive category, but it's the same move as critiquing the social, saying the social is not a bigger zone around the individual. We're fooled because it's spatially larger, but that doesn't mean it's more inclusive. So he seems to be somewhere along his life, he got this sense that we've been mistaken. We've been conflating spatially larger with the next level. And he's able to track that down in a number of different ways. And when he knocks those things off, he ends up with a really interesting picture. And I don't know of anyone else who's been so relentless in making that critique.
Yeah, it's a sort of quintessentially non-American point to make, that bigger isn't better, or necessarily. But yeah, and I think actually it's really interesting once that kind of clicks, so to speak, because again, with the quadrants, I remember looking at the lower right quadrant, and it begins with galaxies, and then it like leads to like family, or like tribes or something. And the idea that somehow that was a progression seems strange, because you'd think of it as you want to do the size comparison thing. And again, maybe I'll just save all that for when we get to that as a specific point. But yeah, I think that quintessential move is what allows him to reformulate the whole holarchy thing, and provide, I think, a pretty good, at least to me, it seems like a very valuable corrective to a lot of these other maps. Norgard.
So with the quadrants, are these fundamentally epistemic or ontological? Now, I suppose they're kind of both. And it's okay, because ontology and epistemology are deeply interrelated, interdependent. Ontology, of course, if you're probably, a lot of you guys are probably familiar. Just to recap real quick, that is what is being, what exists, what are the categories of existence, and its epistemology is how did you know? What are the processes through which you knew or came to believe something? So which of the two are primary? Okay, so you can say, well, you can't know something exists, there has to be a process through which you do that, right? How did you know what exists? But then you also can say, if you can identify a process for coming to know something, aren't you assuming that something is, that you are something? So the two cannot, I don't think, can be completely separated from each other. And in fact, there is an epistemological and ontological definition of both of the quadrants. There was someone last year who tried to make a 4x4 grid who no longer identifies with the integral movement. I thought his framing of that makes things needlessly complicated, because indeed you just, I think, accept that they're both on, the quadrants are epistemic and ontological at the same time. But I like, though, that you can approximately identify epistemic channels, because that, I think, helps you understand ontology at a deeper level. We can recognize that there is an external channel of what exists independently of my mind, your mind. What can we measure? What can we achieve that very high level of mutual understanding of? And we use science for that. And then we also have, inner conscious experience, qualia, etc., thoughts, feelings, and that is a separate epistemic channel. It's good that we can use this tool, this quadrants, to recognize we don't want to just automatically reduce everything to either interior or exterior, because otherwise we would have a tendency to do that. And I think a lot of people who come from the world of science do that all the time. And I think the fact that we are recognizing these quadrants doesn't commit us to an ontology. Now, indeed, within most of the integral movements, people who are practitioners for years have been able to identify a deep non-dual. Some other people might think that there is a deep ontological pluralism. But I think that this, having things as that quadrants like this does help for this. Now, regarding Brendan's point about, that the vertical dimension between the singular versus the plural, I have a different way of analyzing that I'll save for later.
Cool. Yeah, that's a good contextualization. So because we haven't gotten to the actual explicit laying out of quadrants in this book yet, is there anyone who is like, what's the quadrant talk mean, who just wants like a little context for that, or are we all on the same page proverbially, if not literally? Okay. Yeah, well, so this has been something that came up for me when I was reading Wilber for the first time was, the split between, for lack of a better way of putting it, subjectivity and objectivity in philosophy, especially with the beginning of modern philosophy. It goes all the way back to the beginning, with Descartes, if you think about him kind of beginning this. And it splits to kind of two major camps. And there's sort of the idealists who are like, everything is fundamentally mental or subjective or whatever. You can put maybe phenomenologists in that camp too. So there's the idealists, broadly speaking, and maybe the rationalists. And then there's the other camp who says, no, it's fundamentally all matter. It's all stuff. It's all objective. And that's sort of the empiricist route. And for a long time in philosophy, it's sort of been this war between, idealists and empiricists. And what struck me about what Wilber was doing was in some ways being like, no, you're both right. Like, we don't have to reduce matter to mind, and we don't have to reduce mind to matter. We're just going to say, yes, correct. And I think for me, that's an ontological move. It's to say that, ontologically speaking, subjective interior reality is its own kind of reality, and objective exterior reality is its own kind of reality. And you could either say that that's a brilliant kind of, detente, or kind of, truce, or a kind of synthesis of some kind. Or you could say, well, maybe he's not following kind of Occam's razor and getting to the simplest thing here. He's just sort of allowing both camps to simultaneously exist. I think that that's a critique that I don't think is the strongest one. I think it provides him the ability to do some really great things by allowing both the subjective and the objective. And again, because of that vast history in the philosophical tradition, seeing that split as being a kind of almost natural one makes sense intuitively. But then what he's talking about in this chapter is individual and social. So going from that subjective and objective, maybe I'm reversed here, subjective, and then making that plural. That to me has been the more questionable, move, because there isn't really a broad philosophical tradition of like, well, actually, now that I say this, maybe I'll qualify this. I was going to say there hasn't necessarily been the same kind of broad philosophical debate around like singularists and pluralists per se. At the same time, the question of the one and the many also has a deep history in philosophy. So, but that basic move is the one that I think he's outlining in this chapter, of moving from the individual to the social and saying that we need to take these as being almost like ontologically distinct and valid spheres in their own right too. That's how I interpret it. And, maybe that's not the best way to see it, but that's how I get it. So layman, set me straight.
I mean, there is, like you said, a long philosophical discussion about the relationship between the one and the many, but part of what I see him doing here is being more symbolically gender balanced, let's say, because one of the reasons that we've seen these singular and plural not really discussed the same way the inside and the outside have been discussed is, generally speaking, these have been single, male, well-educated, hyper-egoic individuals wondering whether their individuality is in something or everything is in their individuality, right? And so the idea that there are other beings with whom they are in relationships is a huge, I think, ontological and epistemological dimension of reality that they've conveniently underemphasized in the entire discourse of philosophical history.
That's a good point. And one wonders, had there been more Hypatias in the world, whether or not that would have been an imbalance that was, corrected for. But yeah. And for me, where it all makes sense or really kind of becomes a fully coherent thing is that once you accept that an individual is an individual in relationship, which is sort of the logic of holarchy, then you don't have anything like an isolated egoic individual. You have a part in relation to a whole and to other parts. So which is sort of the initial framework that he sets out when he talks about holarchy, which seems in some ways to be maybe one of the least, how do I put it? For me, it seemed like the biggest kind of, here's my axiomatic kind of framework here. It wasn't quite as established as I think once we're working with that, because in some ways you have to counter the whole Cartesian dualist thing just to be able to make the idea seem convincing or significant, that like actually all individuals are individuals in relationship too. And so then the social is immediately there and presumed wherever there's an individual, there's the social. So I mean, I think it works. Anyone else have any other thoughts?
Well, I'd also say that it builds in, and Wilber's quite overt about the fact that he's doing this. Non-duality is built into the structure. So it's not the case that you evolve significantly through all the structure and reach the non-duality. The non-duality is the implied nature of this entire structure. These are relationships that aren't boundaries, right? They're not fundamental distinctions. There's a point at which you're the individual in relationship or the part and the whole. And because those are always coupled, you're always simultaneously experiencing both of them as non-contradictory to each other. then this is a map of non-duality, essentially.
That to me is the biggest thing that hasn't clicked yet, is the nature between all this form, which is the quadrants and tetra arising things in form, and the non-dual foundation. And I know, and he uses a lot of metaphors about, well, you know, the tetra arising quadrants and form is what is sort of written on the page of non-dual spirit and things like that. And like, that's helpful. But there seems to be, trying to integrate the whole tetra arising world of form with the formless emptiness of non-duality. That's the thing I'm not like, because, and it seems like there is a presumed fundamental distinction then between those, which would be a kind of duality, which, I mean, maybe what I'm getting at here is like this, to have that click is to have the whole notion that form is emptiness and emptiness is form, and I'm just not enlightened, so that one hasn't really clicked yet for me. And if I ever do have that one click, then, you know, that's presumably an important spiritual milestone. And so maybe at the moment this is working much more at the level of sort of cognitive engagement, and there's but yeah, that how those structures hang together which is in many ways also the tension between stages and states, because the non-dual thing is achieved, you know, as experiential reality through state exploration or state development, but the formal engagement, the engagement with the world of forms is what is arising, you know, through the quadrant. So I don't know. I don't know if you have more that you could say about that could help bring those things into better, you know, alignment in my head. But
I think there's a little bit of a linguistic problem in the way he and lots of people talk about this, because when we're saying non-duality, do we mean the changeless, formless half compared to the form and changing half? Or do we mean the fact that both of those simultaneously coexist and can't be disentangled and are each other? Right. So there's some ways of talking where you would say this formless, changeless, underlying consciousness reality, that's the causal principle or an aspect of the causal principle. And it's not non-dual until you say that it isn't different than the other one. And at that point, you're saying something that sounds very much like the definition of a holon. You're describing an intercontext, something that can't be fundamentally separated from being in relationship. It is being in relationship. So I think it's simpler if we're thinking of those two halves, the two truths, as exemplifying the relational structure that is present as all the other relational structures. And so you always only find that one everywhere. It gets a little trickier if we think of it as half the picture that we're missing.
Yeah, okay, that's so, okay. And again, like for that to really intuitively click would be the goal, but also probably beyond any kind of immediate logical, like, oh yes, I see that now. And besides some kind of Zen epiphany. But you're saying that like at every single experience of reality, the non-dual thing is there, it's present, and yet we don't perceive it as such. And so that raises part of that question. And it's like to perceive it as such requires a certain state change to apprehend that reality. So it's like, well yeah. I don't know. Sally, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just think there's some interesting distinctions that can be drawn, and he mentioned some of this in chapter 2, and I just pulled up my notes, between the qualities of the ground of being or emptiness and manifestation and fullness. He says that, I made notes on chapter 2, so I'll just read it, that holons have capacities, and those might be different from the ground of all being, because he says there's 4 capacities: self-preservation, self-adaptation, self-transcendence, and self-dissolution. So those are qualities that holons have. Those wouldn't be the qualities of emptiness or the ground of all being. So there's a distinction in their capacities. So they're not the same thing. So they interpenetrate. And I personally, because I've grappled with what is non-duality, I think non-duality includes duality. It's opposite. So there's like this mental gymnastics you have to do, because we know that we're in manifestation and there's a boundary between me and you. We're in duality. At the same time, we have the capacity as a holon to self-transcend, because he told us there's 4 capacities, and to experience tastes of the oneness. So it's almost like we can move between the two fluidly if we build that capacity. But if you just look at the qualities, they have different capacities and qualities. That's fascinating. We can experience both. If we're skilled enough, we can experience non-duality. Not everybody can access that. So if we've managed to practice enough and can do that at will, I can, or anybody who can do that, can enter a taste of it. But can we physically, we can't enter it until we've dropped our bodies, because our bodies remain in duality.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question too, because like there's also the notion that states by developing states can become stages, or and I've been actually reading a lot into this lately too, in terms of there's actually a lot of scientific and medical evidence that long meditators, their brains are working differently and they've got traits. There's a book called Altered Traits. And I think that that's what's meant by this notion that if you develop your state capacities, you can develop your stage capacities. But there's the question there of, yeah, you can get a taste, but if you do that enough, can it become a permanent quality of your existence? Which in some ways seems to be what people were talking about with the idea of being enlightened. I'm actually going to do a podcast with someone tomorrow who has been meditating for a long time, and I was really intrigued to hear him talk about he no longer lives in a state of experiencing himself as sort of distinct from other things, and this has now become just sort of a continual, way of being in the world. And so I thought that seems like a great instance where state development has led to a lasting stage shift of some kind. And so, yeah, I guess that's sort of an open question. I guess I'm saying that maybe there are ways that can be permanent while we still are embodied, because why not, right? Because if I am non-dual and I get it and whatever, that clicks finally, then I don't need to shuffle off my mortal coil, for that to be real.
So Brendan, the question is your body itself in duality or non-duality?
I think that the whole notion would be everything fundamentally is participating in that non-dual reality, right?
But you've got a temporary holon. Your body is a temporary holon.
Maybe my body is, but the consciousness that is performing as me, that's here, is still there in the non-dual state. And so as a body with a consciousness, or rather as a consciousness maybe with a body, I can experience the non-dual state. And that would be the notion. I mean, it's not like there's a non-dual thing and then, we can finally, after we do a certain thing, like achieve it, right? I think the presumption there is that it's always there, it's always in the background, but it's a matter of whether or not we can perceive it and apprehend it. And I think your point, I think the most you could say would be that maybe having a material body and being occluded in the many ways that are egoic shadings of reality and our limited perspectives and all that can kind of obscure the deeper fundamental reality a lot and make it a lot harder to experience it. But I don't think that there's anything that needs to like fundamentally change in order for that non-duality to be the reality that we experience. If that's my impression. Again, I have not. I don't. I mean, whether or not I could say I've had non-dual experiences, that's something else. But like, do I perceive this moment as being a non-dual? No, I don't have. That has not. I've like come back out of that. There, and a lot of the mystics, like cross-culturally use the language of like occlusion, of that as you experience the deeper and deeper state of reality, it's like you're sort of removing things that are blocking your vision, or like incrustations on gold and things like that are falling away. The imperfections are sort of removed, and then you're sort of more purely aware. And so that would be my take. That's how I would express that. Sarah? You're muted.
I wanted to ask a question about the word causal. Please, can someone tell me why the word causal?
Yeah, I treat it as a shorthand for self-causal. So it's essentially the aspect of reality that's perfectly self-justifying, right? So the sense of pure consciousness, or pure self, or pure unity, or pure nothingness, or the equal sign in mathematics, they don't have size or shape or color. They're almost like pure syntactical functions, and they're perfectly self-justifying. I am because I am is a self-causal statement that we shorten to say causal. Okay,
great, thank you.
So it can't be reduced further, Layman? Is that what you're saying?
It's
non-reducible.
Can't be reduced further. It's absolute in a sense. It justifies itself. It's its own proof, and it doesn't have any additional expansion or contraction that would make any difference to what it is.
Layman, do you want to expand upon or correct anything that I was just saying about non-duality in your take on all of that?
Well, like I was saying before, it's a bit of an ambiguous term, non-dual. The way I think of it is, I liked when Sally said fluid, and the apparently non-dual and the apparently dual strike me as being somewhat fluid into each other, because even a temporary form is a temporary form in relationship to a formless non-temporal reality. Otherwise, it couldn't be distinguished. So every temporary form is in part a temporary form because it is in connection to the non-temporal, and the non-temporal is formless, but in a way it has a form, which is that it's distinguished from forms. It has at least that much form. So there's a place in which both of them fade into the other in a yin-yang sense. And so there's not a cutoff like a line or a chop between these things. Each one, if you follow it closely enough, passes very fluidly into the other one as the already existing co-structure of everything that is.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of...
or so it seems to me.
It makes me think of, the kind of traditional stages of jhana meditation. There's the four form jhanas, and then there's the four formless jhanas. And it's sort of like, as you progress through those shifts in consciousness, you're sort of you're passing from an experience of form to an experience of formlessness, and ultimately leading towards this sort of empty pure awareness, I guess. Or and which is, I guess, to say that the ground, that emptiness thing, which is a non-duality, is comprising, or is well, yeah, this is where language becomes really hard, because you can use words like it makes up reality, but of course, if you're making up reality out of emptiness, what does that mean? You could say, I guess, maybe putting it like formal reality, shade into emptiness. There's a whole area here which doesn't necessarily need to come up now, but it will come up later for me. Is I have apprehensions about whether shading into emptiness is a form of nihilism, and to what degree embracing non-dual emptiness is a kind of embrace of nihilism, which I'm. So again, we'll get into that probably later. And Lehman, I'd like to hear your thoughts about that. I know you love Nietzsche too, and so the specter of nihilism is interesting, and the concerns about Buddhist ontologies kind of promoting certain nihilistic tendencies has been a kind of long-standing issue. And I think that, I mean, certainly Wilber seems to be working within a kind of, generally speaking, a Vedanta or a Buddhist, ontological and cosmological framework. So anyway, yes, Brandon Norgard.
Yeah. Within integral theory, within Wilber's framework, he is partial to Buddhism. A lot of the terminology and framing of Buddhism, actually, I might be in the minority, and that a lot of it just doesn't really work for me, doesn't add up for me. And when I read similar sort of Hindu works, that actually connects with me better. Now, I know that they were in dialogue for thousands of years. In some cases, I think there's a deep connection just with different terminology. Within Hinduism, they wouldn't talk about so much like emptiness or nothingness. They would talk about an all-encompassing everything, and that seems to work better for me. So the reason I wanted to mention this is because I think there can be more than one integral theory. I think it's not a monolith. It's a participatory thing. There are certain things that are more central. There are certain things that are a little more on the peripheral, where individuals have room to have their own interpretation, or draw from different sources, or prefer this or that. So for me, I'm going to probably lean a little more toward, in terms of Eastern philosophy, probably more the Hindu rather than the Buddhist.
Yeah, and actually that's interesting. He talks a little bit about that in the beginning of the Religion of Tomorrow, and sort of the four turnings of Buddhism, and how you can, I think to your point, kind of understand the language of, Anatman as sort of like the fact that a whole different religious lineage would begin from like a distinction that is so deeply metaphysical, and like lead to these hugely branching areas that like maybe the distinction of that is sort of very, very shaded or something. I have a lot of thoughts on that, but I don't want to monopolize. Layman.
Yeah, I grew up loving Hinduism myself, even though I practiced more in Buddhist lineages. But I like that Brandon brought up this idea of multiple ways to do integral theory. Bruce and I do this series on looking at different meta models, and we think of Wilber's as a preeminent example of a class of integrated meta theories that can be constructed. And in theory, he said yes, he said no, he said yes again. Bruce and I are going to be talking to Ken in a couple of days on our meta model series. And one of the things we want to talk to him about is whether he would update the way he talks about certain things in science if he had those books to write over again, because some things have evolved and been tweaked, and some of his general sense about certain disciplines might have been produced in the 70s or 80s when he was deep into those books. And for me, in this chapter, that coalesces around the triune brain theory, which was very interesting. It's very evocative, and it makes a lot of intuitive sense. And it's a great physical example of this enfolding idea. But in the last 20 years, there's been a lot of very serious neurological and evolutionary criticism of MacLean's idea. And so one of the things I've been doing with this chapter is trying to think, you know, how can you preserve this idea of enfolding levels, knowing what we know now about neurophysiology? And so I'm curious, you know, to help inform me going into that discussion, what everybody else thought and felt around the triune brain concept.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. That was where I was going to go next, actually, because I have, even in the margins here, I don't know if you can read it, where he's talking about, I say, still legit. Because I've been seeing, you know, articles actually just recently, a couple of weeks ago, that was talking about precisely this, that basically it's much more the case that the brain uses existing structures and sort of adapts them for new purposes rather than just builds sequentially on top of things. And so I think, you know, I'd be curious to see if he would go in the direction of, well, that might be, you know, there might be some deep truth to that, but still metaphorically, or, you know, as an example, it basically works. There is a general sense in which, you know, we have these purely kind of mammalian elements and anyway, so, but yes, that was a question of mine too. And again, probably one of those things that I don't think it all hinges on, but I feel like that's certainly an area where now 20, 30, 40 years after the science he was working with, we could start to like refine that a lot more than his presentation.
I am particularly fond of that phrase of his, which to me is like a sutra. It's like a mantra. It's so beautiful. I can just sit and savor it forever and apply it wherever I look. Is all development is envelopment. Just exquisite. And I'm still wondering if it's true. So I keep looking everywhere. Is that true? Is it true? I haven't found an instance where it's not true yet. I mean, what a remarkable sort of essence of his whole teaching. And maybe it applies to the triune brain. We don't know yet. So I'd love to hear if, in fact, it's not true about the brain. Did the brain envelop? Yeah. It seems like it. It's like the synapses can go everywhere and be plastic, but the basic structure is not plastic.
I think it's still possible to describe what the brain does in terms of enveloped layers. It's just that the way we talked about those layers in the mid to late 20th century as being, you know, the reptile brain and the mammal brain and the monkey brain, those aren't really the enveloping layers. There's something more complex and more underlying. They're information organization systems. They only have this rearrangement of neural networks was enveloped by this informational rearrangement of neural networks, which doesn't always look like a chunk of brain folding around another chunk of brain, but it could be conceived as electrical and informational networks folding around each other behaviorally.
I've also, for me, all right, I think about dolphins and sharks. All right, so, let's say whales and sharks. So sharks are ancient fish, dinosaurs, basically. And at some point, and I don't know the exact phylogenetic tree and all that, but basically, you know, yes, we went from there were animals in the water, and then they became amphibious, and they came on land, and then mammals descended from those. But then at a certain point, mammals went back to the water and became whales. And to the untrained eye, and to many early scientists, they thought, oh, whales are a kind of fish, right? But then until we had Darwin and the whole thing, that we could realize, oh, actually there's this thing that happened where these things came out of the water and then they went back. You can note a lot of the distinctions that are still there that mark it as a mammal, but at the same time, I feel like saying that whale has retained all that it developed through the mammalian process. It also seems like it shed some of that again in order to adapt to an aquatic environment again, right? So this has come up for me even from the first chapter, the questions about, is evolution always complexifying and differentiating, right? Well, a whale looks a lot like a fish. So like, is it getting more differentiated, or are there instances where just sheer adaptation to environment can actually reproduce, structures that are much more ancient again? And is that devolution or de-evolution or regression, or is it just change, which I think is the whole point that general kind of standard consensus neo-Darwinian thought would have, is just that, no, there is no arrow of evolution. It's just everything is changing according to its environment. And so trying to impose this teleological attractor point map, or even of complexification, might not always be accurate. So I don't know if you wanted to throw something that by him, but I think that there are elements you could probably better examples you could come up with where that would seem to kind of challenge some of those ideas, which ideas that I'm highly sympathetic to. I'm just, also devil's advocate.
There's another great thinker that I love to listen to is Satguru, Jaggi Vasudev. And he always talks about memory. To him, that's all that exists, is memory in different forms. Genetic memory, neurological memory. Like, Brendan, you have a nose on your face that somehow replicates your grandparents' noses and your parents' noses. And that's just memory that's built into the system. So he sees it quite differently from Ken. So this idea that even karma is memory, that there is, like, to someone like Satguru, that's all there is memory that's built into the system, and it expresses in different ways. So if you have brain plasticity happening, like, say, trauma, there's something that holds your plasticity in place for a while because it was so intense. That's just memory. So there's repetition builds memory. And so the more you repeat something, the more plastic your brain, the plasticity of your brain responds, and there's change. So the relationship between memory and repetition, as far as he's concerned, is what builds the world. That's fascinating too.
What is his name, Sally?
He's a wonderful thinker, Satguru. Jaggi Vasudev. He has unbelievably complex thought that he teaches in the most simple ways so that everybody can understand. He's a master teacher of deep Vedantic thought in a very simple delivery. It's beautiful.
Brandon, did you want to say something?
Yes, well, in terms of this, updating the science of integral theory, especially with this triune brain, if perhaps, it's been debunked. But then if we look at a more functional level, we can see, I think there's still a distinction between the really sensoromotor and, and then above that you have the feeling. So you have to have the sensoromotor, and you have to have the valence qualia at the base in order to have this conception of others within your group. And that's the mammalian capability, and then above that you have the ability to have more rational thought. So now, whether I guess anymore we think the science doesn't really identify those with specific areas of the brain that you can identify from a cross section. I think that Greg Enriquez has this. He's identified. If you look at this article here, he's saying, okay, there's a distinction between body, mind, heart, and mind, and I think the body being the more sensoromotor, the heart, like with in air quotes, being the capacity for this emotional connection, and then the mind being the rational portions, so those connecting together. And then he's also identifying a spirit, which is the fuller, deeper interconnection with your environment in which you're embedded.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I like Greg's phrasing a lot. And one of the things it does that also we've picked up a lot more in the last couple of decades is the neural systems are distributed throughout the body, right? So it's not necessarily that you would look at a chunk of the skull to see the most primitive sensory motor system. You might look at the extended autonomic nervous system, or then you might look at the kinds of nervous systems we have in our torsos and things like that. But I wanted to bring this back around to the question of the individual and the social and how they co-develop, because I've been thinking about crows, and they're notably more sophisticated in their consciousness than most of the other bird species, even though they have basically the same brain shape. But what really seems to distinguish them in terms of scientific investigation is this much longer youth period, like humans have. They get to be kids for a long time because of the social arrangement of the adults and the peer groups in crow society. So whatever happens there, a layer of crow consciousness envelops the normal layer of bird consciousness. And it does that in a way only because there's a corresponding social structure among the crows. Otherwise, we wouldn't get that effect, whatever that real enveloping is, that isn't necessarily a brain chunk growing around another brain chunk, but it's only there because that social thing is there.
Yeah.
Or they always come together. Maybe.
And I think it might be an unfair level of simplicity to be requesting that all development needs to literally show some kind of, formal envelopment, or all development. Yeah. Because I mean, like a sentence needs words, for example. He uses that example, right? But like a sentence has no extension. It doesn't literally envelop per se words necessarily. And so I think that thinking more about development as envelopment can still retain its profundity and functionality when understood kind of conceptually, rather than necessarily that there is literally like a reptilian brain and all that sort of a thing.
It's metaphorically.
Right.
Too.
Right. Unfortunately, I've got to head out, but I've really enjoyed this so far. Wish I could stay. So continue, and I will see you guys all soon.
See you, Brandon.
Talk to you later.
See you.
Bye.
And I don't want to do too much without our leader, Mr. Dempsey, and I had, and in fact, I still have this presentation that is, it's based on more of Greg Enriquez's work, which I think that the reason that I like him so much, and also he has a lot of work with John Vervaeke, and there seems to be a lot of consensus around them regarding psychology and cognitive science, and it really makes sense to me, most of it, and it's also pretty popular. So that's the ground for me for those areas, and I have a way of identifying, that there could be, rather than these three spheres that Wilber got, and I think he got it from Chardin, the physiosphere, biosphere, and noosphere. A lot of the work in SES comes from that distinction. Okay, so I want to be able to present on what is a reinterpretation of that based on a splitting of the biosphere into recognizing that there's a zoosphere aligning with the mind, and then also interpreting the vertical dimension of the quadrants, singular versus the plural, in terms of the 4 planes of existence that Henriquez identified, and I'll explain why. I don't want to get into it right now because not everyone's here, but maybe we can talk about that next week.
We love synthesis, Brandon.
I hosted a discussion between Greg and Steve McIntosh last year. Ostensibly, it was going to be about wisdom energy and value energy, but they got into a real disagreement about where the cutoff thresholds are going to be. And Greg wanted to strongly make this sort of what I would call neuromobile organism distinction. And Steve was very focused on slime molds and the appearance of phenomenon just as complex and information processing like and mobile among vegetative organisms. And he wasn't backing off on that an inch. I found it fascinating that that's where they would draw their line of distinction. Greg's coming at it from, in a way, a disciplinary point of view. He wants to be able to explain why this is psychology and why we don't normally do psychology to flowers. And that's reasonable because we normally don't, but it's also reasonable to say sentient beings in general have an enormous amount of commonality. And we may want to have like a general category of the biosphere and subdivide it, but not think that those subdivisions are somehow in opposition to treating it as a very common big chunk.
Yeah, and I watched that and I took notes, and that's part of my presentation when it comes around.
Well, I'm extra excited.
And my presentation is also based on listening to this podcast series, which I recommend for everybody. Conscious Evolution. It's 6 hours long. Conscious Evolution. And I don't know what podcast player you have, but you can search for it. You can bring it up, listen to it when you mow your lawn or whatever you're doing. So I tried to take notes when I listened to that as well, and I tried to incorporate that into this. We'll see.
So I've got a question to ask everybody because I've been thinking about it ever since I ended with chapter 2. He raises the question of, is there any real autonomy? This is fascinating. If we are both parts and wholes in any given moment, is there such a thing as autonomy? Like that's directly applicable to us and our development. So he says, maybe there's just patterns. He mentions 4 kinds of patterns. Entelechy, Aristotle spoke about entelechy, which is kind of just an intuitive unfolding. There's morphic fields, Sheldrake's morphic fields, where we kind of vibrate together and there's a morphic resonance and we start unfolding. Kussler spoke about code. I don't know anything about Kussler, so I can't expand on that. And then Wilber himself talks about depth structures, which develop, as we know, through the stages. So there's these various ideas of how we operate in the field. But the question is, if these are true, if we're patterns, if we're unfolding entelechies, if we have depth structures that unfold over our life trajectory and we don't have a lot to do with it, and all we can do is facilitate it really, or block it as our context doesn't allow us to unfold, then is there autonomy? That's the basic question. Is autonomy real?
My tendency is always to say relative autonomy is real. We can seem to be more autonomous or less autonomous. We can seem to gain autonomy. So it might be that the question phrased in terms of absolutes is not applicable. There's no such thing as either complete autonomy or no autonomy. There's only autonomy relative to something else.
Right.
But I would add one other thing, which Wilber stresses in a number of places. He's very interested in the element of creative novelty, and that the thing that allows there to be anything at all rather than nothing, it didn't just occur in a single event. It's omni-distributed through the system. And in each moment when our patterns move together, there is something as if creating something out of nothing in that moment. And that might be like our autonomy. It's something in addition to the patterns that are coming together.
He had a word for that. symmetry breaks. He says creativity only emerges, distributed through the universe when there's a symmetry break. I'd love to know what he means by a symmetry break that produces novelty.
It's the line of flight. It's the third thing. It's the thing that twists into novelty. The symmetry break. Yeah, and that is the limit. That is kind of, well, yeah, it's not freedom. It's probabilities.
It's potentiality. Given
yeah,
the right
probable, but got to do with probables. It's not the total sea of all possibility. It's the sea of probabilities. Can I just quickly say something about non-dual? I was thinking while all of you were speaking. Is it not? Can you not simply say that it is?
Sarah, I think you just changed your sound somehow. We can't hear you.
No, I haven't touched it.
I see that Brandon has his hand up, but I'm not sure who's supposed to call on him.
Well, I wanted to let Sarah go next. Yeah, somehow, Sarah, suddenly your sound got much quieter. Perhaps you could just kind of speak louder.
Okay. Well, how is it now?
It's good.
Oh, is that fine? I was thinking. I don't know where I cut off, but I was wondering whether you could say that non-dual was simply unseparated, a lack of separation, non-separate. Whether you could define it as a lack of separation. Anyway, that was I thought I was busy having.
It's like defining it through the negative, the neti, the not separate. That's really interesting.
I think you can, but my own temptation would be to take that one more step and say that it's the non-separation of the separate, right? So that it's these two things that are not separate. There's no duality between them, but there's no duality between that and the appearance of duality either, right? It's the non-separateness of the separate. That distinction.
Yes, that's the non-separateness of the separate.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Brandon?
Yeah, so I wanted to address this question of autonomy, whether there's genuine autonomy. Any of these complex systems, any small thing can actually impact the behavior of these smaller holons within the greater system. And that is one thing that could account for apparent randomness. There are also possibilities that everything is ultimately deterministic based on known laws or laws that we could theoretically know about. There are some people who believe that. Now, Wilber, I think, seems to be going with that there is genuine possibility for deviation or unique choices or autonomy, and especially within more complex holons. And I tend to agree. I think that the universe is both driven by laws, natural laws, but those don't determine 100% of what happens. I think that we have this agency that is holonic. Like, I think myself I am comprised of smaller holons that have a certain agency. They are driven by natural laws, but there is something going on, and it happens to, I believe it's driven by the information energy. That when you have a larger integrated information system, within my brain, that's a pretty big integrated information system. But within this group, we're also having an even larger integrated information system. So there is some degree of autonomy at an individual level, but also within a group level. As the information becomes more integrated, so I can think that there is a certain kind of agent determination, or it's kind of like a dualism or a soul. Although at a very, very deep level, I think that it's a non-dual. So that's really only a partial picture. So that's the way I see it, is that this choice fills in the gap of what the natural laws don't 100% determine. And this is also something that I suggested to Greg Henriquez that he could perhaps have another series of dialogos with John Vervaeke and perhaps also with Chris Mastropietro, where they could talk about the connection between psychology, cognitive science, and freedom and autonomy and existentialism. And perhaps at some point in the next few months, they might get around to that.
So I think we're back to this incredibly beautiful, simple axis that each part of the holon has agency, which we might call self-determination and communion, right? So each part has that possibility of agency or communion, but that part is up against something which Wilber calls emergent pluralism. And he calls these 4 different things. This is what each little part is up against: patterns of existence, tendencies of evolution, propensities of manifestation, and the laws of form. That's a hell of a lot to be up against. We're swimming in that. Is there such a thing as autonomy, even if we have agency and communion, when we're up against those dynamics?
Well, there's certainly a tendency to try to discuss this in the objective mode, right? We're like, let's have an analysis of the whole system and see whether there's a little bit of wiggle room left over for free will or no wiggle room left over for free will. But there's also the subjective side of it, which is when I feel like I need more autonomy in my life, I can get that autonomy, and it doesn't matter whether the universe is totally deterministic or not. It looks exactly the same. So what I often mean as a person by autonomy has nothing to do with whether there's objectively some special function called agency in my analysis of the system. The system could be absolutely determined by all those patterning factors, and yet I can still have more or less autonomy in my life or in any given situation. So I want us to keep the subjective element in play as well.
So your interior, just thought experiment, your interior feels really autonomous.
Mine specifically?
Yeah.
Well, I might think of that as a pretty good level of cooperative integration among a lot of parts. And there's a side effect of that seems like some agency or some autonomy, and that quality can be increased or decreased without saying anything for or against the objective presence of autonomy as a feature of the cosmos.
Okay, so I've got a question then. If we've got Maslow's pyramid and autonomy or self-actualization is top, and we've already looked at the nature of holons, that they are, the higher the layer, the more reliant they are on the lower development. So take that out, you're done. There's no autonomy without that. Like, so that even Maslow's pyramid is built on meeting basic needs before you can feel autonomous. So like, is that an illusion that you feel autonomous?
It's not an illusion that I feel that way, but that doesn't mean it isn't very dependent or even completely dependent upon other factors. I don't think there's a logical contradiction between the experience of autonomy and the fact that everything might be completely determined and dependent.
So, take away food for 3 weeks or water for 3 days or air for 3 minutes. How autonomous are you?
Well, I stub my toe and my feeling of autonomy goes down.
Yeah.
So it's a variable, my feeling of autonomy. But the fact that it is dependent upon things doesn't change the fact that it can go up or down.
The fact that you've just said autonomy is dependent on circumstances. Like, what a paradox.
Exactly.
Autonomy is dependent.
That's part of what I was saying earlier, in that I think Wilber is right on in building non-duality into the whole system, because I don't think there's any fundamental problem that can be thought of apart from non-dual paradox. Once you're familiar with the structure of non-dual paradox, the quote unquote structure of it, then it's at the heart of absolutely every aspect and every question. It would have to be dependent freedom and free dependence at the same time.
I mean, what I adore about Wilber's brain is that he reduces these beautiful truths into like the simple truth of agency and communion. You can wrestle with that for the rest of your life. Like getting into that simple Venn diagram at deeper and deeper truths for the next 50 years. It's just mind-blowing to me, the fractals of wisdom within his beautiful tiny little maps.
Might say it relates a little bit to his personal spiritual practice, because it's like he built the map out of koans.
Yeah, exactly.
Out of koans, you say?
Or sutras or koans, yeah. Just or mantras.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's why he just didn't speak to anyone for 3 years, because he was just absolutely boiling in his own, mind, in his boiling intelligent alcohol.
There's another thing that I am interested to talk about at some point, which is what is, and I just want to leave this open now. I'm going to leave this open and probably leave the call just because I think it's appropriate. What is integral theory if it isn't necessarily based on the work of any one particular person, And I think I have a partial answer. What we have right now, I like Wikipedia a lot. You go to Wikipedia, type in integral theory, it comes up with a disambiguation page that offers two possible definitions, Wilber and Laszlo. Now I read Wilber, he draws upon Laszlo. I haven't yet read Laszlo, but he perhaps even draws upon Wilber. And then Wilber draws upon, among others, John Gebser, who apparently was one of the first to mention the term integral theory, and then also Sri Aurobindo, who had integral yoga. So how then would we define integral theory without necessarily referencing the work of a single person as the anchor point?